Hi, this is Tisch Aitken, and it is Tuesday, October 28th, 2025. There are a lot of points transiting in water, and it is Scorpio season. And this gives you a lot of information through your intuition, your emotions, how you feel, listening to your inner voice, really listening to your intuition, not just the linear, rational side of your brain, but also listening to your instincts. Because Scorpio, we've got Mercury, the planet of learning and information. It will remain in Scorpio through tomorrow, October 29th, but right now it is in the sign of Scorpio, and it's very perceptive and intuitive. And Mars, which is the planet of action and drive, is also in Scorpio. They have been moving closely together. And Mars formed a beautiful angle to Jupiter, which is the luckiest planet. And Jupiter is transiting in the cardinal water sign of Cancer. It's going to retrograde on November 11th at 25 degrees of Cancer. And right now it's definitely slowing down, and Mars formed a beautiful angle to Jupiter in its exaltation, and Mars is also in its home sign through November 4th, and then it's going to enter the sign of Sagittarius, and that's a different energy. It's optimistic and fun and adventurous in Sagittarius, and it likes being in a fire sign, but it happens to be in its dignity in the sign of Scorpio because it rules Scorpio in ancient astrology. So right now we are working with Mars in its home sign, and this, in the next day, starting today, Mars is forming a grand trine in water. There are a lot of trines going on, and that's when 2 points are in the same element generally. Sometimes you can have an out of sign trine, but in this case you have Mars, and right now it's the last degrees of Scorpio, forming a beautiful angle to Jupiter in Cancer. And the two formed a trine exactly at 2:19 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time early this morning. And that is a very exuberant, optimistic energy. And right now we're all working with a lot of very foggy, very challenging circumstances. We have Saturn, which represents our limitations and challenges, at the last degrees of Pisces, and it will station direct on November 27th at 25 degrees and 9 minutes of Pisces. And we will feel it 5 days before and 5 days afterwards, and that definitely gets emphasized at the very end of November. And Saturn's moving closely with Neptune, which just returned to the sign of Pisces, the sign that it rules in modern astrology. Neptune represents the dream, and Neptune is in Pisces. It entered on October 22nd. It will remain there through January 26th. Saturn will be in the sign of Pisces through February 13th, and the two meet up at the very first degree of the zodiac at 0 degrees and 45 minutes of Aries on February 20th of 2026. And that begins a whole new dream that we're all structuring together. That's on the collective. That's going to represent major new beginnings that we all got glimpses of earlier this year, starting at the end of the spring when Neptune initially ingressed into the mutable water sign. No, mutable. It left the mutable water sign of Pisces, which it rules, on March 30th. It entered the cardinal fire sign of Aries, a sign of new beginnings. We are carving a new identity, and we are dreaming a new dream. And Neptune entered there on March 30th and it left on October 22nd. It will come back to Aries on January 26th of next year. And Saturn, how you anchor, how you build what you need to take responsibility and accountability for in order to build what your dream is. So in a sense, we're getting glimpses of the future. Saturn was in the sign of new beginnings, the cardinal fire sign of Aries, from May 24th through September 1st. Then Saturn returned to the sign of Pisces, and it finishes up in the middle of February, on the 13th of February of next year. And that is wrapping up some karma of things you need to release, figuring out what's keeping you from the dream, maybe those areas that need to be tended to, that need to be healed, spiritually finding something to ground you and have faith in a time that can seem very, very, just seem really directionless for some. Very, very hard to navigate. And Saturn is in its detriment technically in Aries, but I find people that have that, or its fall position rather, because it's exalted in Libra, which is the opposite sign. But I still find people born with Saturn in Aries tend to be go-getters. They tend to really be good at getting things going. It's a cardinal fire sign, and Saturn in Aries is maybe vulnerable about self-identity. And right now we've got Chiron in Aries through early next year, and it's in the sign of identity and ego and self. But we're going to have a lot of focus on carving a new identity with Saturn and Neptune meeting up at the very first degrees of Aries. So right now we're in a time where, again, things will not seem irrational. Sometimes it'll seem very confusing. Sometimes you'll feel on top of the world if you tap into the creativity, tap into nature and beauty. Right now we've got Venus in its dignity in Libra. It remains there through November 6th of this year. And so that is, lovely for partnering, for doing creative things, for fixing up your wardrobe or your image in some way. Definitely good for cooperating with other people and working with them in some partnership type capacity. And you've got Mars in its dignity through November 4th. And right now, Mercury, which is the planet of learning and perspective and communication, is in Scorpio. And it's going to retrograde in the sign of Sagittarius on November 9th. And it will retrograde initially at 6 degrees and 51 minutes of the mutable fire sign of Sagittarius. And we're already in Mercury retrograde in the shadow period, because Mercury got to 20 degrees and 42 minutes of Scorpio on October 15th. And that's the degree it will station direct on November 29th, because Mercury will retrograde in Sag. And that's about trying to re-examine how you tap into optimism and hope and learning and finding things that enlighten you and give you, again, something to believe in order to magnetize good fortune. And Mercury in Sagittarius is technically in its detriment. It rules the opposite sign of Gemini. But I find people that have Mercury in Sagittarius tend to be very optimistic. They tend to have a good sense of humor. And they tend to ingest a lot of information, whether it's a lot of newspapers, news, reading, learning through life experience. They're very curious about education and about also, again, tapping into humor. And that's something that we really need to focus in a time that's very challenging. Saturn and Neptune can seem very difficult. Neptune is transiting at the very final degree of the zodiac at a fixed star known as Shiat, which is a difficult placement. And it can be connected very much with depression and with self-sabotage and feeling very lost. It can also be connected with severe weather patterns. And we're seeing, right now there is a big hurricane going on in Jamaica. There are going to be, unfortunately, big weather patterns with that. And it's very scary, but we have to realize that that's part of Neptune at the last degree that can sometimes, historically be connected with severe weather patterns and with challenges with mental health. But again, how do we help other people? The last degrees of Pisces represents people that can't always help themselves, and it represents mental health issues. So, we've got Mercury trining Neptune in Pisces, and that occurs at 3:26 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, at 3:26 a.m., and this is very much about tapping into the dream. Then Mercury enters the sign of Sagittarius at 7:02 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. It's going to be in the sign of Sagittarius on and off through January 1st of next year, because again, it's going to retrograde on November 9th in Sagittarius, return to Scorpio on November 18th. It stations direct on November 29th in Scorpio. Then it returns to Sagittarius on December 11th. And then it leaves Sagittarius on January 1st of 2026. So in Sag, tapping into hope and optimism. In Scorpio, tapping into those areas of self that you don't like to address, those areas of yourself that you're uncomfortable with, that you need to heal, that are wounded, maybe from a long time ago, that you, again, don't want to face. And about finding empowerment in that vulnerability, and in facing that, you do empower yourself and embolden yourself. And Mars and Scorpio forming a grand trine where it's, again, 120 degrees away from Jupiter. And then tomorrow at 3:05 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, it forms a beautiful trine to Saturn in Pisces. And that does anchor and does give stability to what you're trying to achieve with Mars in its home sign. Mars in Scorpio is saying you have confidence, you have courage, even though things seem uncertain right now. Jupiter in Cancer is expanding through trusting your intuition, through nurturing yourself and nourishing yourself in challenging times. Mars is forming a beautiful angle to Jupiter. Jupiter and Saturn are forming a trine to one another, and that's a beautiful energy. And that is bringing structure to the dream. They squared one another on June 15th of this year. That's a different energy. That's a conflict in trying to build form to what you're trying to magnetize and attract into your life. Now it's more of an expansive flow. And we've got Mars, forming, let's see, so again, beautiful aspects to Jupiter and Saturn. Mercury enters Sagittarius, and then it opposes Uranus tomorrow. And that happens at 3:36 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And that is a big surprise. Uranus is in Gemini. It returns the sign of Taurus on November 7th. But Mercury rules the sign of Gemini, and it's technically, again, in its detriment now, opposite Uranus. It's going to oppose Uranus 3 times because, again, it's going to retrograde in early mid-November, the first, in November 9th it retrogrades. So again, you're going to have Mercury opposing Uranus tomorrow for the first time with Uranus in the sign of Gemini. Then it'll oppose Uranus again on November 19th when they're both at the last degrees of Scorpio and Taurus. Mercury will be at the last degree of Scorpio, and Uranus will be the last degree of Taurus, and then they will oppose one another a third and final time on December 10th at 27 degrees of Scorpio and Taurus. So this is bringing awakening and bringing your attention to something, new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking things about things. And with Sagittarius, it's liberating you and giving you solutions with Uranus and Gemini of how you can break out of something, how you can adapt to something. In Scorpio and Taurus, it may be more intense emotionally, with Mercury in a sign that's much more, really goes very deep and is incredibly insightful, but can be very, really getting to the depth of things. Can be very good for self-healing, so that's not a bad thing. Which is also interesting because, so as we get to the weekend, we've got Venus is going to form a T-square with Chiron and Jupiter. So it's going to oppose Chiron, the wounded healer, on November 2nd at 1:37 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And then Venus is going to square Jupiter, the luckiest planet, at 6:16 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time at 25 degrees and 2 minutes of of Jupiter, Venus and Jupiter, of Libra and of Cancer. So Venus is in its home sign and Jupiter is in its sign of exaltation. And that does bring expansion and opportunity. That is the two benefics, even though they are technically they're forming a challenging influence, which is a square. They're 90 degrees apart. But in the same vein, that can propel you forward. It can be a lot of fun. That is, Halloween weekend. But it also could be too much. And maybe it's too much around, I don't know, maybe you feel you're giving too much, you're spending too much, you're thinking too much about others. Maybe you're not thinking enough about yourself. And with Jupiter in Cancer, maybe you need to focus more on that. And Venus remains in the sign of Libra through November 6th, and then it's going to enter the sign of Sagittarius, and just again, it'll do the same thing where it opposes, it'll square Pluto, so make more dynamic aspects. But we've got a lot going on, a lot of water, and we have the first Mercury-Uranus opposition, and we will have 3 this fall. And we are working again with Mars in its dignity. Remember, Mars was retrograde in the beginning of the year in the sign where it's in its fall position in Cancer, where it does not like to be. Now we have Jupiter in Cancer, where it loves to be. So that helps us with all this water, which can be incredibly emotional. Use this to tap into your good fortune with Mars trine Jupiter. That's feeling confident. Mars trine Saturn, bringing form to what you're trying to build and achieve through your hard work with Mars and Scorpio. And Mercury trine Neptune, listen to your intuition. Mercury forming a sextile to Pluto in Aquarius. That happens on the 29th of October at 6:16 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And that's a very enabling aspect. Pluto rules the sign of Scorpio in modern astrology. So a lot that you can up-level, but remember there's that element of surprise with Mercury opposite Uranus. And then Mars will oppose Uranus on November 4th next week. And Mars will be in Sag opposite Uranus in Gemini before Uranus returns to the sign of Taurus. Good luck, take care, and Do a lot of journaling, focus on your dreams. There can be very, very psychic dreams with Saturn and Neptune at the last degrees of Pisces, which is such a wise part of the zodiac because it's the very final degrees of the entire zodiac. Take care and listen to yourself. Thank you.